thanking God for fundamentals. Let's call this chapter The Good Shepherd, understanding that I have skipped over a traditional way of teaching the book of John in the last few chapters that focus on Jesus's I am statements. But you never want to neglect the fundamentals in favor of what I'm typically trying to do, and that is build off of the fundamentals. But sometimes it's important to make sure that they're established before moving forward. And so understanding that I have skipped by at least two of Jesus's I am statements, because he is going to say in this chapter that he is the good shepherd. I want to take a moment to look back to the fact that in the 6th chapter, we mentioned it but didn't really emphasize it, the fact that he calls himself the bread of life. Understanding he is trying to get them to focus not on the miracles that he can perform to give them short-term food or satisfaction, but to refocus on things that have the ability to endure, what we called short-term gains versus long-term gains, a term that sometimes comes from the world of investment. But beyond that, he's going to call himself the light of the world in 2 chapters, I think 8 and 9. 9, obviously, because of the way that he opens the eyes of the blind man, as we mentioned, helping not only the blind man to see, but the Pharisees to potentially see the ways in which they had become blind as well, understanding that his ways provide, as we saw in Isaiah, the kind of counsel that allows us to see beyond potential identity crises. Sometimes thinking that we are further along in a process that we're really not as well progressed on as we should be. And so as he challenged Nicodemus in chapter 3, he is going to open up the challenge to even more of the authorities in Jerusalem at the time to look beyond their identity as Abraham's children or disciples of Moses, to evaluate whether they were really doing the things that Abraham did or whether they were really walking in the ways that Moses has set forth for his people. And so as the light, now he's going to build on that concept, helping us to understand in this chapter that he is the good shepherd, meaning he's not simply telling them things to demean them and humiliate them, but he's causing them to look in the mirror so that they can evaluate where they need to be in relationship to where they are going forward. We're going to get at least one more of those I am statements in the next chapter, where he's going to say not only is he counseling them out of love as the good shepherd, he is the resurrection, as he is in the next chapter going to raise Lazarus from the dead. But in this chapter, organizationally, I want to look at it from the perspective of 2 questions. Who are the characters or things he's introducing to describe himself as the good shepherd, and what is he describing them as doing, or what are their characteristics? Understanding that in a recent Wednesday, we talked about the need to understand in setting context 5 faithful friends, as I was taught being schooled up before I was encouraged to go try to be a preacher. Who, what, when, where, how, and sometimes why are 5 questions that can help us to set context and basically do a more effective job of not only telling us telling others the things that Jesus is saying, but helping to set a full context for understanding the deeper meanings of what he is trying to get us to understand. Understanding that, I want to focus on 2 of those questions. Who, once again, are the players or characters in this chapter? And then 2, what are they doing? Understanding that, he is going to introduce us to, I'm stumbling a lot, but bear with me. In verse 1, he is going to introduce us to the door. We're going to find out that the door is not just a thing, but a person in the next set of verses. But before that, at the end of verse 1, he's going to say, those who do not enter by the door are thieves and robbers. However, in contrast to the thieves and robbers, he is going to introduce us to the shepherd who can be trusted, and likewise his sheep in verse 3. Also saying that another, maybe a 5th character or person in those first 6 verses is the stranger, or are those who could be described as strangers. And the what that the strangers are going to be doing are offering calls that his sheep will not hear, because they do not understand them to be the legitimate voice of the shepherd, who has a trustworthy voice that they actually will follow. The first 6 verses outlines a metaphor that the people, we're going to see in verse 6, they don't understand. So he is going to go into an explanation saying in verse 7, he is the door. Understanding that those who came before him were thieves and robbers, He's also going to say that if anyone comes in by the door, he is going to provide them safety. And so that portion of the what's in his explanation, we will go back through. But he is also going to contrast himself to hired hands who can be trusted to a degree but cannot be trusted to fully care for the sheep, introducing us to another character in verse 12, that being the wolf, who, similar to the thief, is going to snatch and scatter the sheep. Understanding that, he is also going to, I think, give us one final character of a component, one final component of a character he's already introduced us to, that is the sheep, saying that he has other sheep beyond the fold that he is talking about more specifically or working with right now, seeming to be the people of Israel, describing the way that Israel has been described in the prophecies as a light to the Gentiles, a place where all people will be able to come to be reconciled to God. Understanding that, the first 21 verses set up a metaphor that, much like Jesus calling himself the bread of life, is going to cause people to question, and as it caused some people to turn back from him in chapter 6, it is likewise going to cause some people to use a familiar slander and basically say that he has a demon. But as we saw, it causes a division in the crowd where not everybody is going to buy into the slander. Some are going to say, no, these are not the words of a man who has a demon, as they ask, can a demon open the eyes of the blind? Focusing on the thing that will take us to the end of the chapter, they're going to compare his words to his works and see a consistency, not specifically stated this time, but back to the things that John prophesied about the Christ. As verses 22 through the end of the chapter 42 are going to show that beyond the skepticism that him calling himself the good shepherd is going to produce, once again, talking about his relationship to the Father is going to provoke others to specifically or literally want to kill him. And it's basically at their provocation, because verses 22 through roughly 30 are going to say, why don't you just tell us plainly, are you the Christ? At which point he's going to say in verse 25, he's already told them, but he's going to say something that attempts to at least answer their question, showing once again that their motives weren't pure, because in verses 31 through 39, it's going to provoke them to pick up stones to try to stone him again. At which point he's going to say, okay, for which one of the kind works that he has done are you trying to stone him for? They're going to say, not because of that, because you're trying to make yourself equal with God. Well, didn't you ask him to give you a clear answer? Bottom line is they wanted an answer that would allow them to condemn him if he did not fit into the lane that they had drawn for him, as we mentioned before, whether or not the lane that he was walking in was the one that God had designated for him. Beyond that, though, it is going to show us that he is going to appeal, as we mentioned, to the works. Even if you don't believe the words, how do you explain the works that he is doing? That's the question he is going to pose to them, at which point they aren't going to care. Blinded to the reality of the situation, they are going to be, once again, an interesting contrast to those who have refused to close their eyes, because as the chapter will close out, in verse 40, it will say, he went away again across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing at first, and there he remained, and many came to him, and they said, John did no sign, but everything that John said about this man was true, and many believed in him there. At this point, recalling not only his works, not only his words, the teaching that's attracting a crowd, even apart from the miracles on its own, but they're basically triangulating it back to the things that John prophesied about him, understanding that John was reliable enough that they trusted John. And so there is the ability to put the dots together, or connect the dots to realize that this might be the Christ, if you're willing to see it. But it reminded me of the things that I guess caught my attention most about this chapter, and that is some of the things that they might have been able to understand within his explanation of describing himself as the good shepherd might be the contrast between the good shepherd, the thieves and robbers, the wolves, the hirelings, and the strangers. And that is, even though he might be making bold claims about being the good shepherd and about being the Son of God, if you look beneath the surface to the way that he is describing what the good shepherd does, it would actually give you comfort if you realize that he is talking about in verse 9. He is the one who gives safe passage. And if you've ever taken suspect roads or through suspect places, you understand what it's like to have someone with you who can give you safe passage through difficult places. But he doesn't just give safe passage, he provides security while they are there. Saying in verse 10 that he came that they may have life and have it more abundantly, meaning that regardless of the environment, they don't have to live in fear in him or in obeying or taking his counsel in his ways. Understanding that, he is then going to go on to say that he is not only counseling them, he is backing up what he says with the level of sacrifice that he is willing to offer on their behalf, saying that as the good shepherd, he, in verse 11, lays down his life for the sheep, something he's going to say again in verse 15. But before that, he is going to say that he, in verse 14, has a level of care that produces familiarity with the sheep. So he doesn't just look at them as livestock with their ear tagged or possibly branded for sale at market one day. He actually understands the value in the sheep beyond slaughtering them for meat, as the wolves might do or the thieves might do to sell them in trade. Understanding that one of the things that's easy to overlook about sheep is beyond their meat, they have tremendous value for their wool. And even in their appetites have value. And I didn't understand it as much until I lived in a culture where I actually got to see shepherds and the effect that sheep can have on a territory where you don't need a lawnmower because the sheep are so efficient at grazing a property. And so as opposed to what he'll describe as wolves in sheep's clothing, who are fundamentally opportunistic and will take advantage of others in order to have their needs met, sheep's appetites are fundamentally healthy, meaning they fit in the plan and the environment that God has created. Their appetites are for healthy things. They provide a healthy service in the place where they are simply let loose to do what they naturally do, and that's provide a service in the way that they help to maintain the grass and other greenery around them, and the way that they provide supply to those around them in a way that's a healthy fit with what God has created, insofar as they are being led in a way that fulfills their purpose. Understanding that they're a great metaphor for us. Even though we don't necessarily produce wool, we can produce things that are a healthy fit with the plan and the purpose that we see for God's people, basically all people. Understanding that Galatians 6, I think it's around about verse 9, says that we are to do good to all people, but especially those who are of the household of faith, as Paul will describe it there. And so for whatever reason, this chapter comparing the good shepherd to things like thieves and robbers and wolves reminded me of a prophecy back in Daniel, around about Daniel chapter 11, as he is describing the rise and decline of cultures. He talks about times when there are certain powers that are actually allowed to conquer the saints for a time. But in chapter 11, the thing that seems to distinguish that particular power is the way in which it conquers the saints, not only by force, but by what it calls seduction, convincing the saints to be realigned behind its purposes, reminding me once again of the distinction between the good shepherd and the others in this chapter. One thing in particular in that relationship is the way that the good shepherd calls his sheep by name. But he's not simply naming them. Later on, it goes on to say that one of the characteristics of his sheep is the way in which he knows them individually, it seems, especially considering the story of the one who has strayed from the 99 in previous gospels, but not only the way he knows them, but the way that they know him. Reminded me of a conversation that I recently had with a brother in which I told him I hadn't been telling him, but I had seen the way just during the time that I had known him, the way that I could hear his study come through in the things that he was saying. And it reminded me of the kind of relationship that helps to prevent God's people from becoming repurposed, to the degree that we are genuinely committed, as Hebrews 11:6 will say, as I sometimes say in my favorite version, at least for that verse, in the New King James Version, as it will say, he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. And there seems to be no greater reward in these times than having an understanding of God or a knowledge of God that has practical value in the way that it keeps us from straying behind the voice of others.